Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another reading day. We are moving on now to chapter 18. I'm going to try and finish this book before I start another one, but we'll see what happens with the holiday season. Any gifts I get that are different books, I'll definitely be reading those next. But today, let's go ahead and head over to chapter 18. The Impossible Victory, Vietnam. From 1964 to 72, the wealthiest and most powerful nation in the history of the world made a maximum military effort, with everything short of atomic bombs, to defeat a nationalist revolutionary movement and a tiny peasant country, and failed. When the United States fought in Vietnam, it was organized modern technology versus organized human beings, and the human beings won. In the course of the war, there developed in the United States the greatest anti war movement the nation had ever experienced, a movement that played a critical part in bringing the war to an end. It was another startling fact of the 60s. In the fall of 1945, Japan, defeated, was forced to leave Indochina, the former French colony it had occupied at the start of the war. In the meantime, a revolutionary movement had grown there, determined to end colonial control and to achieve a new life the peasants of Indochina. Led by a communist named Ho Chi Minh, the revolutionist fought against the Japanese, and when they were gone, held a spectacular celebration in Hanoi in late 1945, with 1 million people in the streets, and issued a Declaration of Independence. It borrowed from the Declaration of Rights of Man and the Citizens in the French Revolution, and from the American Declaration of Independence, and began, quote, "All men are created equal, they are endowed by the Creator pursuit of happiness," end quote. Just like the Americans in 1776 had listed their grievances against the English king, the Vietnamese listed their complaints against French rule. Let's see what they had to say. They have enforced inhuman laws, they have built more prisons than schools. They have mercilessly slain our patriots, they have drowned uprisings in rivers of blood. They have fettered public opinion, they have robbed us of our rice fields, our mines, our forests, and raw materials. They have invented numerous unjustifiable taxes and reduced our people, especially our peasantry, to a state of extreme poverty. From the end of last year to the beginning of this year, more than 2 million of our fellow citizens died of starvation. The whole Vietnamese people, animated by a common purpose, are determined to fight to the bitter end against an attempt by the French colonists to reconquer the country. And to put a little bit of a context on here, what this is referring to is, yes, it was a French colony, but later on you'll see, I think 7 to 10 years before we entered Vietnam, it was actually France's war to regain that colony back. So that's kind of what they're alluding at here with this beginning part. The U.S. Department of Defense study of the Vietnam War, intended to be, quote, top secret, but released to the public by Daniel Ellsberg and Anthony Russo in the famous Pentagon Papers case, described Ho Chi Minh's work. Ho had built the Viet Minh into the only Vietnam-wide political organization capable of effective resistance to either the Japanese or the French. He was the only Vietnamese wartime leader with a national following, and he shot himself. Wider, filthy, among the Vietnamese people when in August-September 1945 he overthrew the Japanese, established the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, and staged receptions for incoming Allied occupation forces. For a few weeks in September 1945, Vietnam was, for the first time and only time in its modern history, free of foreign domination and united from north to south under Ho Chi Minh. And that's what a lot of history stuff will teach you in the schools, but also this is later why the United States got involved. Because Ho Chi Minh came to America for his education, went to France, got a culinary degree, and learned a lot of Marxist ideology from there. People don't know that. But also, to add one more person here, Daniel Ellsberg, who I believe passed away recently, because of this released paper, the public knew about what was going on in Vietnam. But add another person to that was Mike Gravel, who passed away last year. A legend, a political legend, but he read the Pentagon Papers on the Senate floor. And he risked being expulsed and arrested for it because that was technically illegal. But that just shows you how far they went for this war. The Western powers were already at work to change this. England occupied the southern part of Indochina and then turned it back to the French. Nationalist China, this was under Chiang Kai shek before the Communist Revolution, occupied the northern part of Indochina, and the United States persuaded it to turn that back to the French. As Ho Chi Minh told an American journalist, quote, "We apparently stand quite alone. We shall have to depend on ourselves." Between October 1945 and February 46, Ho Chi Minh wrote 8 letters to President Truman, reminding him of all the self-determination promised in the Atlantic Charter. One of the letters was sent both to Truman and to the United Nations. I wish to invite attention of Your Excellency for strictly humanitarian reasons to follow matter. 2 million Vietnamese died of starvation during winter of 1945 and spring of 1945 because of starvation policy of French, who seized and stored it and routed all available rice. 3/4 of cultivated land was flooded in summer 1945, which was followed by a severe drought of normal harvest. Fifth, sixth, 5/6 was lost. Many people are starving, unless Great World Powers and international relief organizations bring immediate assistance. We face imminent catastrophe. Truman never replied. In October 1946, the French bombarded Haiphong, a port in North Vietnam. Vietnam, to be funny. And there began the 8-year war between the Viet Minh movement and the French over what would be Vietnam. After the communist victory in China in 1949 and the Korean War the following year, the United States began giving large amounts of military aid to the French. By 1954, the United States had given 300,000 small guns and machine guns, enough to equip the entire French army in Indochina. And 1 billion altogether, the US was financing 80% of the French war effort. Why was the United States doing this? To the public, the lore was that the United States was helping to stop communists in Asia. But there was not much public discussion. And the secret memoranda of the National Security Council, which advised the president on foreign policy, there was talk in 1950 of what came to be known as the quote, domino theory. That, like a row of dominoes, if one country fell to communism, the next one would do the same, and so on. It was important, therefore, to keep the first one from falling. A secret memo of the National Security Council in June 1952 also pointed to the chain of U.S. military bases along the coast of China, the Philippines, Taiwan, Japan, and South Korea. Communist control of all of Southeast Asia would render the U.S. position in the Pacific offshore island chain precarious. Oh, and what it seriously jeopardized fundamental U.S. security interest in the Far East. And Southeast Asia, especially Malaysia and Indonesia, is the principal world source of natural rubber and tin, and a producer of petroleum and other strategically important commodities. I think you guys have the big picture. Natural resources. It was also noted that Japan depended on the rice of Southeast Asia, and communist victory there would, quote, make it extremely difficult to prevent Japan's eventual accommodation to communism. In 1953, a congregational study mission reported, quote, "The isle of Indochina is immensely wealthy in rice, rubber, coal, and iron ores, and possession makes it a strategic key to the rest of Southeast Asia." End quote. That year, a State Department memorandum said that the French were losing the war in Indochina had failed, quote, to win a sufficient native support. Quote, fear that a negotiated settlement, quote, would mean the eventual loss to communism, not only of Indochina, but to the whole of Southeast Asia. Quote, and concluded, quote, if the French actually decided to withdraw, the U.S. would have to consider most seriously whether to take over in this area. And we did. In 1954, the French having been unable to win Vietnamese people support, which was overwhelmingly behind Ho Chi Minh and the revolutionary movement, had to withdraw. An international assemblage at Geneva presided over the peace agreement between the French and the Viet Minh. It was agreed that the French would temporarily withdraw into the southern part of Vietnam, that the Viet Minh would remain in the north, and that an election would take place in 2 years, and a unified Vietnam to enable the Vietnamese to choose their own government, which they already did a long time ago. The United States moved quickly to prevent the unification and to establish South Vietnam as an American sphere. It set up in Saigon as head of the government a former Vietnamese official named Ngo Dinh Diem, who had recently been living in New Jersey and encouraged him not to hold the scheduled elections for unification. A memo in early 1954 of the Joint Chiefs of Staff said that intelligence estimates showed, quote, a settlement based on free elections would be attained by almost certain loss of the Associated States, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam, the three parts of Indochina created by the Geneva Conference to communist control. End quote. Diem again and again blocked the elections requested by the Viet Minh, and with American money and arms, his government became more and more firmly established. As the Pentagon Papers put it, quote, South Vietnam was essentially the creation of the United States. The Diem regime became increasingly unpopular. Diem was a Catholic, and most Vietnamese were Buddhists. Religious conflict. Diem was close to the landlords, and this was a country of peasants. His pretenses at land reform left things basically as they were. He replaced locally selected provincial chiefs with his own men, appointed in Saigon. By 1962, 88% of these provincial chiefs were military men. Diem imprisoned more and more Vietnamese who criticized the regime for corruption, for lack of reform. And that's what happens when you have a puppet government who's beholden to a different government. Their interests are in those who are in charge and not the interest of those who are poor and in the peasantry. Opposition grew quickly in the countryside, where Diem's apparatus could not reach well, and around 1958, guerrilla activities began against the regime. The communist regime in Hanoi gave aid, encouragement, and sent people south, most of them Southerners who had gone north after the Geneva Accords, to support the guerrilla movement in 1960. The National Liberation Front was formed in the South. It united the various strands of opposition to the regime. Its strength came from South Vietnamese peasants, who saw it as a way of changing their daily lives. As U.S. government analyst named Douglas Pike in his book Viet Cong, based on interviews with rebels and captured documents, tried to give a realistic assessment of what the United States faced. In the 2,561 villages of South Vietnam, the National Liberation Front created a host of nationwide social political organizations in a country where mass organizations were virtually non existent. Aside from the NLF, there had never been a truly mass based political party in South Vietnam. Sorry about that. Pike wrote, quote, "The communists have brought to the villages of South Vietnam the significant social change and have done so largely by the means of the communication process. That is, they were organizers much more than they were warriors. What struck me most forcibly about the NLF was its totality as a social revolution first and as a war second. Pike was impressed with the mass involvement of the peasants in the movement. Quote, "The rural Vietnamese was not regarded simply as a pawn in a power struggle, but as the active element in the thrust. He was the thrust." Pike wrote, "The purpose of this vast organizational effort was to restructure the social order of the village and to train the villagers to control themselves. This was the NLF's one undeviating thrust from the start, not the killing of ARVN Saigon soldiers, not the occupation of real estate, not the preparation for some great pitched battle, but organization and depth of the rural population through the instrument of self-control." Pike estimated that the NLF membership early in 1962 stood at around 300,000. The Pentagon Papers said of this period, quote, "Only the Viet Cong had any real support and influence on a broad base in the countryside." When Kennedy took office in early 1961, he continued the policies of Truman and Eisenhower in Southeast Asia. Originally, Kennedy was not interested in getting involved in Vietnam. He was lied into doing so, but also when you're escalating military and political tensions in the country and want to start sending troops down there, then the next administration will continue the policies of the next. That's why this happened. Almost immediately, he approved of a secret plan for various military actions in Vietnam and Laos, including the quote, "dispatch of agents to North Vietnam to engage in quote, sabotage and light harassment." According to the Pentagon Papers, back in 1956, he had spoken of, quote, "the amazing success of President Diem," and said of Diem's Vietnam, quote, "Her liberty, her political liberty is an inspiration," end quote. One day in June 1963, a Buddhist monk sat down in the public square in Saigon and set himself afire. More Buddhist monks began committing suicide by fire to dramatize their opposition to the Diem regime. Diem's police raided the Buddhist pagodas and temples, wounded 30 monks, arrested 1,400 people, and closed down the pagodas. There were demonstrations in the city. The police fired, killing 9 people. Then, in Hue, the ancient capital, 10,000 demonstrators and protest. Under the Geneva Accords, the United States was permitted to have 685 military advisors in South Vietnam. Eisenhower secretly sent several 16,000. Under Kennedy, the figure rose to 60,000, 16,000, and some of them began to take part in combat operations. Diem was losing. Most of the South Vietnam countryside was now controlled by local villagers organized by the NLF. This is going to be the last bit. Diem was becoming an embarrassment, an obstacle to efficient, effective control over Vietnam. Some Vietnamese generals began plotting to overthrow his regime. Staying in touch with a who? CIA man named Lucien Conein. Conein met secretly with American ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge, who was enthusiastically for the coup. Lodge reported that Kennedy's assistant, Mick George Bundy, on October 25th. General Pentagon Papers, quote, I have personally approved each meeting between General Tran Van Dam and Conein, who has carried out my orders in each instance explicitly. Unquote. Kennedy seemed hesitant, but no move was made to warn Diem. Indeed, just before the coup and just after he had been in touch through Conein with plotters. Lodge spent a weekend with Diem at a seaside resort. When on November 1st, 1963, the generals attacked the presidential palace, Diem phoned Ambassador Lodge, and the conversation went as follows. Diem, some units have made a rebellion, and I'm to know what is the attitude of the United States. Lodge, I do not feel well enough informed to be able to tell you. I have heard the shooting, but I'm not acquainted with all the facts. Also, it is 4:30 a.m. in Washington, and the U.S. government cannot possibly have a view. Damn. But you must have some general ideas. And we're ending part of the chapter there. I hope you guys enjoyed the reading, and you're able to learn some interesting stuff, maybe stuff you remember from your classes on world history when you talked about the Vietnam War. Maybe learn some stuff about who was involved and kind of how the domino effect started to kind of quote the book. Again, I do appreciate all the views. I appreciate that. I do appreciate people leaving comments on the shorts and videos alone. I hope everyone did enjoy. That's very interesting for me, but also it is nice to spend time with you guys here and there when I can. I might try to record a video like this or something a little different with the Christmas lights up. I know you guys saw that short. Hope you like the decorations. If you did not like them, okay, decorations not for everybody, but I really did try to make it a little interesting in here. Besides that, I hope you guys have a great day, and I'll see you next time.